Welcome, everyone, to our fourth annual Humane Hoax Chicken webinar. Wonderful to see everybody, and we're very excited to get started. We have an amazing presentation to kick us off. Our very first speaker is Dr. Crystal Heath, and she is a veterinarian. We are really excited that she could take the time to be with us today. She's very busy, a lot going on. And I'll read her bio here. She is an AVMA member veterinarian, a graduate of UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, and the co-founder of Our Honor, an organization that supports veterinarians and animal professionals in advocating for the best interest of others, no matter their species. She's also on the founding committee of Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown and on the board of LEAP, Leaders for Ethics, Animals, and the Planet. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Heath. We're excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm coming from this poorly lit bunker in Los Angeles right now, and the lights periodically turn off, and then I have to wave my hands to turn them back on again. So it should be fun. But I'm sure you've all heard a lot about avian influenza recently. And I was listening to the New York Times podcast, The Daily, and they were discussing the bird flu outbreak. And the host, Sabrina Tavernisi, says to her guest, Emily Anthus, who's been writing about this, after she describes the 90 million birds exterminated in the United States and the numerous wild animals infected, she says, I'm kind of wondering why more people aren't talking about this. I mean, I didn't know any of this before having this conversation with you. It feels pretty worrying. And hopefully you have heard something about avian influenza, and I'm glad there seems to be more coverage about this lately, but it's disturbing how things have had to get this bad before the media has started reporting on it. And since COVID-19 began in 2020, I've been concerned about the threat our modern intensive animal production facilities pose to public health, and have been following the numerous virologists and epidemiologists and public health officials who are concerned about this same thing. And I've come to learn how our systems of disease surveillance and response in the United States and the allocation of public resources seems to incentivize businesses to create the conditions that could lead to the next pandemic. So briefly, who am I, and why do I care about this? I grew up in a rural farm community. My neighbors raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. And because I loved animals, I joined 4-H in the hopes of learning more about animals, and I became vice president of my 4-H club, and I showed my goats and my horses at the county fair. And I was also an avid equestrian and trained and competed horses and dressage and 3-day eventing. But now I'm an animal advocate. I don't eat animals, but a lot of people have heard of 4-H, but if you haven't heard of 4-H, it's something that started in the late 1800s, and researchers discovered adults in rural farming communities didn't readily accept new modern agriculture practices that came out of our research universities. And so they developed 4-H, which is a government-run youth development program based out of our land-grant universities, with the goal of bringing modern technology and information about agriculture to rural communities. So modern agriculture industries hoping to expand were able to connect with those communities through their more open-minded and impressionable children. And in 4-H, we learned a lot of important things like responsibility for the animals you cared for, and that you had a duty to make sure that they had adequate food, shelter, water, veterinary care, and when the time came, a quick and painless death. But I also saw that even in the best settings, even like when our 4-H animals got individualized care, if the ultimate goal is profit, you can't always act in their best interest. So if a veterinary bill costs more than the animal's worth, that's just not a smart business model. but especially the business model of modern industrial animal agriculture inherently betrays those basic values that I was taught in 4-H. There's no way to ensure that these large numbers of animals that we confine receive adequate food, water, veterinary care, or a quick and painless death. So, why is this? It's not the page I was on, but oh well. So I became an animal advocate, not quite on the slide that I wanted to, but and this realization kind of led me to this path for advocating for animals. And one of the things that happened to me was once I started speaking out more about these things, this meme went around the internet about me in all of my veterinary Facebook groups, and it basically says, I pose a threat to the industry. It says that I'm affiliated with the ALF and the ELF, which I was not. I was merely advocating for animals and putting words on the internet, lobbying for change. I was at this point, all I was doing was advocating to ban fur in California, and the industry smeared me as this radical extremist. And it really made me realize that what a threat a veterinarian poses to the industry when they start speaking out about the industry's practices. And luckily, Glenn Greenwald heard my story and was fascinated by this. And he wrote about this as the last article that he wrote for The Intercept. And it made a lot of media attention. And that's kind of how I started Our Honor. And we gathered together veterinarians who felt similarly and who are also concerned about the bullying and retaliation professionals like us face when we speak out against the systems that perpetuate these harmful conditions for animals. And so this is the founding of Our Honor. And we support veterinary professionals advocating for change in our profession, and we help bridge the divide between activists and veterinarians. So back to highly pathogenic avian influenza. Where does it originally come from? This particular variant is classified as H5N1 2.3.4.4b. And this strain originally emerged in farmed poultry in China in 1996. And since then, it underwent continuous evolution through genetic drift and reassortment while circulating within Eurasia and Africa over the past 2 decades. And then in late 2021, migratory birds infected with H5N1 crossed the Atlantic, which led to a dramatic increase in the scope and impact of HPAI. And now more than 90 million commercially raised birds in the United States have been killed. And these are the number of species that have been affected. Dolphins, skunks, dogs, cats, seals and sea lions, deer, bears, horses, squirrels, and more. And no version of this virus has ever before spread this rampantly across as many mammal species or so thoroughly has infiltrated American livestock. And this is the range of symptoms and lung pathology that we're seeing in these animals. And tragically, in Argentina, 96% of elephant seal pups born in the 2023 breeding season died of H5N1. And researchers collected samples from the dead sea lions, a fur seal, a tern, and all were positive for this virus. And the samples shared the same mammal adaptations and mutations detected in the sea lions in Peru and Chile, and then even one human case in Chile. So while it is now adapted to mammals, it can also still affect birds and then cause multi-species outbreaks. And they found the viral sequence in the tern had retained all of these mammalian adaptations. And Dr. Marcela Uhert, a wildlife veterinarian within the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine's One Health Institute, said, as long as the virus continues to replicate in mammals, it may make it a concern for humans. So how does this work? The virus undergoes reassortment, and it changes and evolves and can acquire greater affinity for attachment to cell receptors in different species. Humans, pigs, and birds share similar receptors, and mammals are usually closer to humans. So the more it acquires adaptations to mammals, it can spread from mammal to mammal instead of just in birds. And it might develop changes that increase its affinity for human receptors. And even more concerning, it could develop mutations that then make it transmissible from human to human. And we've been talking about this threat of the next human pandemic for a while now. And back in October of 2022 at a mink farm in Spain, the virus jumped from wild birds to mink, and all the mink had to be culled. And in November 2020, Denmark killed 17 million farmed mink after they became infected with COVID-19. They found the virus spread from human handler to mink, mutated, and then spread back to humans. And experimental and field evidence have demonstrated that mink are susceptible and permissive to both avian and human influenza A viruses, leading to the theory that this species could serve as a potential mixing vessel for interspecies transmission among birds, mammals, and humans. And this is an example of One Health, and this is the concept that we are taught in veterinary school, and it really acknowledges that the health of all species, plant, and environmental health are interconnected. And so it's important for experts in the field of human medicine, ecology, veterinary medicine, epidemiology, and public health to all talk to each other and discuss these things. And 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic and come from animals. So there's this battle within the veterinary profession. Corporate interests want to perpetuate the structure with the man at the top, women underneath, and all species ranked below that based on their ranking of moral concern to us. But in One Health, we should view all species like this circle. There's no hierarchy, because if we cause injury and illness to one of these species, it affects us all long term. And we have drastically changed the biomass of Earth in recent times to the point where now 60% of Earth's land animals are farmed animals and only 4% are wild. 70% of all birds on Earth are farmed poultry, and only 30% of birds are free. And we have lost 83% of wild animals and 50% of plant species. So in recent times, we have drastically increased the number of chickens, and drastically changed how we raise them, confining them by the thousands in massive buildings to prioritize production efficiency. And you might think that this is related to our growing population, but no, we have drastically increased the amount of meat we consume per year from 50.6 pounds per person per year in 1960 to 264 pounds per person per year in the United States in 2020. So in the past 35 years, we have doubled the number of land animals we raise for food in the United States, and that means big profits for corporations. But also many other industries have an interest in this as well, including corporations that grow feed crops and pharmaceutical companies that sell antibiotics and vaccines and other medications for slaughter-bound animals. So if the numbers of animals that we raised for slaughter were to decrease, that would hurt their profits too. And because of this, we are seeing an increase in emerging infectious disease events like avian influenza. This graph kind of shows that. You see this spike in the 1980s and 90s. That was due to AIDS, but the overall trend is still increasing. And around 80% of all antibiotics are sold in the United States are used in animal agriculture, with 70% of these being medically important. And so we are also seeing an increase in drug-resistant diseases as well. So policy-wise, what are we doing to address this problem? Well, it turns out our policies may be making things much worse. And exactly 1 month ago, Andrew Jacobs published this article featuring our work in the New York Times, and the story made the front page. And we discovered how much in taxpayer subsidized USDA indemnity payments corporations were receiving after their birds became sick and had to be exterminated due to avian influenza. So we tallied the totals, and we are continuing to tally these results as the numbers keep rolling in. Taxpayers have spent more than $1 billion to bail out these corporations. Oop, there, I'm going dark again. And we found that Jennie-O Turkey Store received $105 million. Tyson got more than $29 million. And Jennie-O and Tyson are both huge multi-billion-dollar a year companies. Tyson has brought in more than $13 billion despite avian influenza. And their CEO, Donnie King, brought in more than $13 million in his personal compensation. So our tax dollars basically subsidizing his CEO compensation. The majority of these companies failed to invest in putting plans in place to use less cruel methods of killing their birds and resorted to sealing up buildings, pumping in heat, and waiting for the birds to die after several hours. And we obtained public records requests to find out what methods were used to depopulate these flocks. And most of the companies receiving the most money in bailouts we found were using these heat stroke based methods of mass killing. And we received public records from the Minnesota Board of Animal Health that showed how long it took some of these flocks to die. And we were able to match the dates with the bailout money receipts and the locations to figure out which companies these referred to. And we found Jennie-O Turkey Store was using heat stroke to kill their turkeys, and it sometimes took hours for the birds to die. And Minnesota animal cruelty laws specifically state that no person shall keep any cow or other animal in any enclosure without providing wholesome exercise and change of air. So this would seemingly violate those animal cruelty laws. So how did something as horrifying as this, that could even potentially be illegal, come to become industry standard? And then to the point where we actually pay companies our hard-earned tax dollars when they kill their animals this way. This method came to light 4 years ago during the COVID-19 slaughterhouse bottleneck. Slaughterhouse workers were some of the most heavily impacted victims of COVID-19. And when they got sick, they had to take care of their families. They could not come to work. And this reduced slaughter capacity by 45%. And the pig industry works in this just-in-time model where if there's no empty shackles on the slaughter lines, there's no room, no place for the pigs to go. The younger pigs are growing and going to take up space from the older pigs. And so quickly, there was this overstocking problem. They're becoming overcrowded, and the industry needed something, some way to solve this problem because of their inherent lack of flexibility. And so activists, a whistleblower at one farm, Iowa Select Farm, let activists know that this was happening. They were able to record it. And this then got major media attention. And Jen Sorensen, who is the spokesperson for Iowa Select Farms, took to the media and calmed the public by saying, this is a veterinary approved method. Veterinarians and public production well-being professionals are overseeing the process to ensure accordance with the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and the American Veterinary Medical Association. And so veterinarians were horrified by this. Most of us didn't know that this was something that the AVMA had approved of. And we didn't think that our profession should lend legitimacy to such a horrifying practice. And so we founded Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown. Now more than 2,000 veterinarians have signed on to our petition, and we petitioned the AVMA House of Delegates to reclassify this method as not recommended. They voted to push the question back to the panel on depopulation, and then after that even changed their House of Delegates manual so that petitions like ours could not go forward again. And they also changed the number of veterinarians required to submit a petition from 50 to 200. And the AVMA's director of the Animal Welfare Division was concerned about the fact that heat stroke-based killing might leave the guidelines. And she's a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the United Egg Producers and Dean Foods Animal Welfare Science Council. And during an animal mortality management conference in North Carolina in June of 2022, she called on a friendly audience to help her find evidence to support leaving this method in the guidelines. And she says, on tape, one item I would like to place some emphasis on for this room, since I feel you are a little more friendly of an audience than I've had the opportunity to present for over the past couple of years, is we need data from you. And I know we've seen some presented here, even if it's not published, if it's a case report, if it's proprietary data, or unpublished data, the panel needs it. Some of these methods are at risk of leaving the guidelines. I think you probably have an idea of what those methods might be. We need data to support them staying in the document. Why is she defending this practice so much? Even if the AVMA reclassified it, it could still be used to kill animals. The AVMA doesn't make the laws, but the USDA does look to the AVMA guidelines to determine policy and indemnity payments to producers. If it was reclassified as not recommended, under current systems, producers wouldn't get our taxpayer money to bail them out for it. So in this case, it was industry-funded research performed at an industry-funded public research university. At the Prestige Department of Poultry Science, named after Prestige Foods, funded by an industry organization that created the science to put it in the guidelines in the first place, which is then used by the USDA to hand money back to the industry itself. And you may have now heard about the outbreak in cattle, with now 36 herds affected in 9 states. And one dairy worker even tested positive. This was just published yesterday by the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's about the genome sequence of the virus that infected this worker. And this is an actual photograph of his eyes. The person was a dairy farm worker, so there's obviously a link to cattle, but surprisingly, there was no testing of cattle on the particular farm where he was infected. The strain that caused the human infection is genomically a bit different from the main strain that is circulating in dairy cattle too, which supports these concerns that there might be more widespread transmission of this virus in dairy cattle than we had thought before. In this paper, they say that the virus identified in the worker's specimen had a change that has been associated with viral adaptation to mammalian hosts, and it's been detected previously in humans and other mammals infected with these viruses. And we aren't yet positive about how these cattle came to become infected. We think it was some sort of interaction with birds. We know it's now been circulating in dairy herds since December. But in searching for the root cause, the media finally took an interest in the fact that we feed poultry litter, which is literally shavings, poop, and deceased birds, all the stuff that falls to the floor of a poultry facility after birds go to slaughter to cows. We grind it up, we make it into a pellet, and we feed it to cows. And dairy cattle aren't supposed to eat this. Their milk is being sold to the public. And because of the antibiotics and various medications given to poultry, there's this withdrawal time from these drugs. But we know the industry doesn't tend to follow the rules. So it's possible that this made it into cattle somehow. And there's finally some media attention on the fact that our food system really seems to be built on poop, which is quite disgusting. And on April 7th, the AVMA allied organization, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, issued a statement calling for highly pathogenic avian influenza in cattle to be called bovine influenza virus A. The statement says, we believe it is important for the public to understand the difference, to maintain confidence in the safety and accessibility of beef and dairy products for consumers. But maintaining consumer confidence is not part of the veterinarian's oath. And now we are finally seeing a whole new group of scientists, infectious disease experts, publicly criticizing the veterinary profession for this move. Ryan Gregory, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Guelph, tweeted in response, isn't there a system for formally naming viruses? And isn't that system managed by someone other than the American Association of Bovine Practitioners? And yes, the International Society for Infectious Diseases released a statement saying, we don't need to say that the sky is falling, but we also don't need to waste time and energy pretending an HPAI virus is now so different that it requires a name change as an urgent order of business. As noted in previous commentary, this isn't the first time influenza A viruses have been found in cattle, so we would invite the AABP to fully justify their rationale as to why now is the time to do this. As with every other time veterinarians attempt to add the species name to the virus, we're just going to regret it later because we always end up finding more strains. See swine influenza, canine influenza as prime examples of why using a species name makes no sense with the diagnostic tools we have today. Let's stick with calling it influenza A and worry about dealing with real problems, not misleading the general public or even giving anything close to the appearance of doing so. And so now that we have this milk from positive cows, it has very high concentrations of virus. What do we do with all of this milk? Well, we dump it in theory. And modern cows produce a lot of milk. In 1999, the average cow produced around 18,000 pounds per year. Just over 20 years later now, the average cow produces 24,000 pounds per year. That's 6 to 7 gallons a day. And what are they doing with all this milk that's being dumped? University of Ontario infectious disease researcher Dr. Scott Weiss recently published this blog post describing the options and explains how we don't just flush it down the drain, and we can't pasteurize it all. So this milk will usually go into manure pits, and normally that manure is then sprayed onto fields to irrigate pastures and crops. This would obviously be an infectious disease nightmare. But even just having this high viral load in the environment, there is a risk to wild birds and other animals who might come into contact with it. If this mammalian adapted virus spills back into wild birds, they can more easily infect cows and potentially pigs and other species as well. And I really hope that the neighbors of these dairies start recording footage of manure lagoons with thousands of gallons of milk and the wildlife in the area. And if dairies are then spraying this onto fields, the public needs to know, and the media should report on this. And throughout the outbreak, we have seen a lot of headlines telling us the milk is safe and giving us various reasons why. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association issued a statement on March 25th saying the USDA has confirmed that affected dairy cows do not appear to be transmitting the virus to other cattle within the same herd. That was proven to be incorrect. And then Julie Anna Potts of the Meat Institute said HPAI cannot be transmitted to humans by eating meat or poultry products. And now we know around 20% of commercially available milk does have H5N1 virus. Some infected milk is making its way into the food supply. We believe pasteurization deactivates the virus, but around 4% of Americans consume unpasteurized milk products. And the CDC recently updated their fact sheet saying H5N1 mammalian adaptation could represent a risk not only for diverse wild animals, but also for human health. And Scott Gottlieb, a former US Food and Drug Administration commissioner, says there's always a tension between human health people and animal health people. The human health people would swab anything. Animal health worry more about the economic implications. But when he talks about the economic implications, he's really talking about my profession's concern with the short-term profits of a few corporations. We have to shift our focus to long-term economic and greater public health implications. This report shows how that if instead of bailing out corporations like Tyson and Jennie-O Turkey Store, who repeatedly suffer losses from infectious disease outbreaks, if we shift our investments towards low carbon, such as plant-based or slaughter-free methods of food production, we would save $7.3 trillion in global health burdens and ecosystem degradation. But the problem is that the USDA, the governmental organization responsible for disease surveillance, has a directive to protect the economic interests of producers and expand markets. And this is a tweet a few days ago from Tom Vilsack, who heads the USDA, talking about just that, protecting the US livestock industry and creating new markets. Ideally, the USDA would be about ensuring food security and public health. And the livestock industry is a method of protein production. And it's a method that's dependent on confining and slaughtering animals. It's just a method. Why are we protecting an industry that's just about a particular method of protein production? And it might make more sense for executives of these corporations that currently slaughter animals for food to redirect investments towards producing protein directly from plants or investing in non-slaughter methods of food production. Why not do that? Well, let's look at the USDA's partner in crime, the AVMA. Who is the AVMA? Their stakeholders include pharmaceutical companies and animal agriculture corporations. The pharmaceutical industry and the feed industry are both very dependent on increasing the number of slaughter-bound animals. If we decrease the number of animals raised for food, that would mean fewer medications sold to these animals, fewer vaccinations, and these industries are very closely tied together. And the USDA realizes they have to have some way of tracking animals for disease traceability purposes. So they have made some changes and they've mandated electronic ID tags for interstate movement of cows. And producers are very concerned by this, though. And this is an industry that is used to not complying with the rules. This is that independent spirit of rural America, except they're taking billions of our tax dollars, whether we purchase their products or not. So they should have some obligation to comply with the government organization that they profit from. And in this informal Twitter poll, 69% say that they would not comply. And an ag influencer, Amanda Radica, fosters this suspicion, saying it's not really about animal disease tracking, it's really about control. But now we are seeing a whole new group of people talking about our systems and questioning the existing power structures and the decisions that they are making. These aren't just radical vegans and animal rights activists. These are epidemiologists, virologists, and public health officials. And the dominant call to action in the past by advocates has been to go vegan. But we have to realize that we do pay for this, whether we purchase these products or not. Sure, if everyone went vegan, there wouldn't be an industry, but the industry has drastically changed our diets using our tax dollars to do it. They didn't necessarily change our diets by saying eat meat. They did it more subtly using social pressure and changing our habits and marketing to appeal to our subconscious desires to be accepted by others and consider ourselves strong and powerful. For men to be masculine, they had to eat meat. Not eating meat meant you were feminine and all of that stuff. And the industry also communicates directly to the media. And we saw with these outbreaks, the headlines were always about the price of eggs, is the milk safe? And we saw these stories that made us sympathize with producers who lost animals due to disease outbreaks. And these stories rarely go beyond these big questions. How much are we paying for this? How much the public funds these producers? How much do these executives of these companies make? And the numerous externalities related to this form of food production. So how can we change things? We all have unique strengths, whether it's writing, speaking, organizing, and no matter what profession you are in, you can advocate for change. And I've been thinking about this, and I can't help but draw parallels between the USDA and the FDA. And I think a lot about the activism of ACT UP and how they were able to change the narrative around people with AIDS and even influence AIDS treatment protocols and drug approvals with their activism. And normal people without medical degrees became experts in AIDS treatment and drug testing, spoke with experts, influenced the way that people with AIDS were treated. But they also spoke directly to the press, and they sent them posters they could put up in their newsrooms to educate journalists about how to discuss people with AIDS. And that's what our honor has been doing recently. We create a community of professionals advocating for change and amplify their voices in the media. And we're sending out advisories to the press and statements about the ongoing outbreak to try to change the narrative and get the media to move beyond just asking about the price of eggs and whether the milk is safe. So we were able to even get a front page story on the New York Times recently, as I mentioned earlier. And we're even making some changes in the AVMA. Dr. Martha Smith Blackmore is one AVMA delegate who posted a photo on her Twitter account with activists last year in January. And at the House of Delegates meeting a few weeks ago, she discussed the need to address intensive animal agriculture, and she shared our executive summary with her reference group. And soon there will be a lot more of us in positions of leadership empowered to speak out. But I will mention, I also tried to join the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, and I was rejected from joining their group. And Susan Lieberman, the vice president of the Wildlife Conservation Society and a leader in the One Health movement, says, this quote is great: "The impediments to One Health in the past and moving forward are entrenched economic interests." And this is the older generation of veterinarians that use technology and innovation to prioritize the mechanization and industrialization and efficiency of modern slaughter-based protein production. And think of all of the advancements we've made in genetic selection, nutrition, robotics, vaccine, and medication development. But what if we aligned our technology with our conscience and considered the best interests of others? We could use that technology to produce food without killing animals. And this is the current generation of veterinarians, and they care about justice and climate change and the environment. And we have to empower them to push back against the harmful systems and redistribute our investments towards methods of food production and research that don't require the large-scale destruction and exploitation of other animals. Beans, nuts, vegetables, and now things like precision fermentation could feed the entire planet using a lot less arable land than we have now. And we can get from this triangle method of our view of the world towards the One Health circle, but we have to kind of connect with our ancient caveman instincts to empathize with other animals. That is an instinct that we developed over 100,000 years ago. That is what our true nature is. And with that, I will take any questions. I'm floating in the dark here in my bunker.
Thank you, Crystal, so much. What an amazing presentation, really informative, just incredible. And there's been a lot of interesting thoughts in the chat, and we have some questions. So I'm going to try to formulate some of those here. And one thing actually that I wanted to ask is kind of back in the beginning of your presentation, you had a slide about the symptoms that animals have. Like it was wild animals listed, and the slide went by a little too fast.
Yeah.
What are the symptoms, and how do these animals get sick, or how does it affect them?
It's interesting. There's a lot of different symptoms depending on the species. They all have neurological signs, which is something that you wouldn't think of a flu virus would have neurological signs. Not all of them have respiratory signs, nasal or ocular discharge, but like tremors and seizures is something that we see a lot of with this virus. And some of them it infects the lungs, and some of it doesn't. So it just depends on the different tissues that it interacts with. But I wonder if how much we know about the neurological symptoms, if it seems to like go to the brain, or are the neurological symptoms because of the other systemic issues and sicknesses from the virus? Is it because they are hypoglycemic and then seizure and have tremors because of that, because they're not eating? We're not exactly sure, and I haven't looked into each of these cases yet. But it's interesting, not all of them have lung pathology, but most of them do. So
yeah, it's just so sad when I saw that list of all these species of animals that are sick, out there by the thousands, by the millions, possibly sick from this, thing that we created from our farming of animals. It's, wow, horrible.
And one thing I wanted to add to this presentation, which I didn't have time for, is I wanted to talk about, if you read the New York Times article, we also bring up Harvest Home Animal Sanctuary, who was affected by HPAI. And
they're in California, right?
In Stockton. And I went there, and they only lost 29 of their like 160 animals. So there's kind of this myth that like, oh, we have to kill all of the birds because they're going to die anyway. And really, that's not true. Many of them do live. Ducks in the wild, geese tend to live. They carry the virus and don't get sick often, depending on the strain and depending on their breed and their species. So a lot of these animals do get sick, carry it, and then can spread it to others.
Well, right. Just like in the human population, there are people that die of the flu, but there's a lot that don't. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so, okay. And there were some questions, some thoughts in the chat about the subsidies. And I also wanted to kind of maybe bring it back to that, and how on earth that a CEO could get $13 million in subsidies. It makes no sense. When you think of subsidies, you think of, like a small farmer that was hurt terribly because of some situation, because of weather or whatever it is, or something like this. And, they're possibly not going to be able to pay their bills for the next year. And so they get subsidies. That's, I think, what people are thinking that these subsidies are for farmers. But those numbers were outrageous.
And it's really disturbing, because it's usually the small farmer who isn't getting these subsidies. And there's all these contract farmers. So there's a lot of small contractors who actually are the companies, these big companies contract to take care of the birds and feed them and everything. those contractors don't get the subsidies, or they get very small amounts. All of these subsidies end up going to the big companies, and these small contractors are usually left high and dry, and these small farms usually aren't either, and they have a hard time getting insurance and stuff. But of course, the system is set up to protect the most powerful, and they use the stories of like, oh, these poor small farmers, when really all the money is going to the most wealthy corporations who are doing the most horrible things to the animals.
Wow. Wow. So one other question that came in the chat, I think, was how can we encourage our veterinarians to get involved? I mean, most people here probably have companion animals of some kind, and take their animals to a veterinarian. How can we let our vets know about all of this, about your organization? How do you kind of gauge whether a veterinarian is, going to want to hear it, or
Yeah, I mean, veterinarians are very busy, but I do know some of our honor veterinarians, the reason that they became advocates was because their clients came to them with a pamphlet and gave it to them. And I think that's, letting them know that there's this group of veterinarians advocating for change and maybe they should get involved with them, I think is the best. It's like we're not telling them to go vegan or like anything like that. It's like, we're here to support you, take action, for the animals, make our profession better. Because right now the AVMA is ruining our reputation as caring advocates for animals. And I think most veterinarians do not like the AVMA. Most of them don't understand exactly why they don't like the AVMA. They have like a lot of little minor beefs with them. Still, a lot of veterinarians don't know about ventilation shutdown. So, telling them about this, saying veterinarians against ventilation shutdown, we have our flyers, and I need to put more things on our website, but you can print our flyers. You can send me a message. I want to update and have more flyers that you can print out and give to your veterinarians, but also just sharing our social media content and our newsletter. We put out a weekly newsletter, sharing that with your veterinarian, tagging them on social media with our honors content, letting them know about us is a great way, because we've been blocked. We weren't allowed to present at the AVMA convention. Some of our honors veterinarians applied to give talks and were denied. We applied to exhibit at the AVMA convention. We were denied. And they've done this in the past to Animal Welfare Institute. There used to be an association called Association of Veterinarians for Animal Rights, and that became HSVMA. They weren't allowed to exhibit at the AVMA convention. So they purposefully want to keep us out. And I've been blocked from veterinary Facebook groups because of that meme that went around. So it's hard for us to connect, but please do share our stuff on social media, tag your veterinarian, forward our newsletter to your veterinarian, and I think we can get the word out.
Wonderful. Good. Well, I think that's going to be a good place to wrap up, because I did want to ask you how people could get involved. I don't know if you have any more thoughts about that, just as in wrapping up. And just to let everyone know, we're going to have a 5-minute break and then come back with the sanctuary panel in about 5 minutes. So we're going to wrap up. But Crystal, do you have any final thoughts on how folks can get? Oh, also one more thought before you say that. If anyone does have more questions, there were a lot more questions than this. Put them in the Q&A. And Crystal, if you wouldn't mind maybe hanging around and answering those in typed form, that would be great, so people can get their questions answered. We didn't have enough time for all the questions, but yeah, what more can people do?
Our honor always needs volunteers, because veterinarians are so busy just treating animals. We don't have time to actually do the activism part of it. So I do a lot of the work and the writing, but we need writers. We need people who want to do graphics and social media. And so if you want to connect with veterinarians, help us get our message out, and use whatever skills that you have, whatever connections you have, like please email me, reach out, and we can get you plugged in and involved in helping to amplify this and reach out to veterinarians. And yeah, we do need a lot of help. So please email me and help us out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time and all your work, all your effort on this. Just really, really amazing.
Thank you so much.